Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
The ability to prove your ID for a bank account or for public services may be taken for granted in much of the world, but many countries still lack this basic infrastructure.
For about 1 billion people on the planet, there is no ID. They don't have anything that identifies them. Not an easy problem to solve, but technology is coming into the picture and things are moving really quickly.
Prime Minister, give us a sense. Don't give us just one reason. It's a big enough issue. Give us two reasons. Two reasons why it is essential that digital IDs are at the top of your agenda in your country.
It's seen as so important that it's actually a part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals.
For the government of the DRC, access to citizens' rights is a key aim. To enable this, proper population registry and the guarantee of a unique legal identity are essential.
But the push for complicated biometric ID systems has meant expensive contracts in some of the poorest countries in the world, leaving the door open to corruption. On today's podcast, we'll explain how a $25 million shopping center in the DRC's second city shows why the country still has no ID system and how money that was supposed to fund it may have ended up benefiting only a few. I'm Jeneifer Zabasajja, and this is the Next Africa podcast, bringing you one story each week from the continent, driving the future of global growth with the context only Bloomberg can provide. This investigation is a partnership between Bloomberg and Lighthouse Reports reporter Tomas Statius, who's been working on this story, and he is joining us this week. So, Tomas, thank you so much for your time. I mean, it's a really fascinating story, and there's so many different layers to it. But maybe before we get to the crux of the story, which is this ID card project that was turned into a shopping center, let's maybe take a step back and get some of the history. What's been behind the push for biometric IDs in Congo and other African countries? And also, what made you interested in wanting to look into this?
The behind-the-scenes story of the push on biometrics starts like more or less 10 years ago when two institutions, the UN, published something called the Sustainable Development Goals, which are like the goals that the UN and humanity was to achieve by 2030. And one of his goals is actually for any individual on the planet to have a certain ID card and a certain identity defined by the state. And around the same time, essentially, the World Bank, another multilateral institution, essentially start to push also for the same goal, but with the addition of a technology called the biometric technology, which is, so to speak, everything that makes you unique as a person. So your fingerprint, your iris, your behavior, and so on. So those two elements combined create a real gold rush for vendors that are mostly Western vendors. A lot of those are French, German, and even from the US, to go to this new market, which is the continent, the African continent, to try and sell this technology to those countries. As for the reason we wanted to get interested in this partnership between Bloomberg and Lighthouse Reports, the investigative outlet I'm working with, is essentially there's a techno-solutionism narrative behind biometric technology. There's this idea that technology can fix everything. It can fix election, it can fix unbalanced states, etc., etc. And this narrative is actually quite powerful. So we wanted to have a look at behind what's happening in some of the most extreme situations that we can find.
Wow. And this is very extreme for people who get a chance to read it. So then let's get to maybe Congo, right? Because this is the country that you focus on. What was the existing ID system that was there when you and the team started looking into this?
Essentially, when we started to have a look at Congo, there are no kind of, let's say, general identification system as we know it in some of other countries, whether it's Southeast Asia, whether it's Western Europe, whether it's North America. So in Congo, when we start to look at the system, there are no functioning ID, meaning people did not have driving licenses. The state has no idea how many citizens lives in Congo. The last census was performed in 1994. So at the time, the country was called Zaire, and the head of the state was someone that actually I'm sure people listening to this podcast know quite well, whose name was Mobutu Sese Seko. So it was like 40 years ago. And essentially, the only kind of identification that people have in day-to-day life or voting cards. But voting cards are no proof of identity because essentially you can say whatever names you want to put on your voter cards because there is no unique identification system. So that was the starting point from the investigation. And along all those kind of ideas that are not working properly in Congo had for a couple of years one of the most expensive passports in the world that cost $185 each passport, essentially.
And it's one of the 10 poorest countries in the world. So that seems like a contradiction.
It is a contradiction, but it is also a very important market. The last census in DRC stated that DRC was populated of 20 million people. The projection by the UN states that it will be one of the giants of the African continent by 2050. And right now, the population is estimated around 1 million inhabitants in Congo. So it is quite a big market for those vendors. So it is quite a hassle for all those companies to try to set shop in the country. And there's a lot of money to be made.
Which is perhaps how, we're at the situation now. And Tomas, I thought it was really interesting in the story how you note that the fact that we mentioned this in the intro, some people take advantage of the fact that they have IDs, right? But in Congo, you noted that Congolese people feel like foreigners in their own country.
They are. They feel they are foreigners, but they are foreigners. As I said, there is no kind of identification. And it means very concrete stuff for day-to-day life for the people working, for instance, in the inner city of Kinshasa. It means they cannot cash a check. It means they cannot send money abroad or they cannot receive money from abroad. I remember meeting this guy around the community center in Kinshasa telling me that he was having an interview for a job to be a pool attendant at the US embassy. But if he doesn't have any kind of identification, he won't be hired. Even more, he won't be authorized to go into the building because the security people from the embassy would not let someone in that their identity is not certain. So it means very concrete stuff, for day-to-day life for Congolese citizens. And this situation has been going on for 40 years. It also means a lot of consequences for the government. How do you levy tax? How do you know who owns which house? How do you send a fine to someone a speeding ticket to someone who's done some stuff dangerous on the road? It's impossible if you do not know the identity of the population. And that's been the situation for the last 40 years.
So that gets to the opportunity then that an ID system could present. And then this additional layer of biometric databases, which you were mentioning, they're expensive. We talked about how Congo is one of the poorest countries in the world. What was the plan here? What was it that was being pitched?
What was being pitched at the time is that essentially an ID system cost a lot of money, and supposedly the IDs, for it to be very well spread among the population, it needs to be cheap because, as you say, Congo is one of the 10 poorest countries in the world. You need to have incentive for people to register and so on. So the idea at first by this Belgian company called Semlex, who at the time approached former DRC President Joseph Kabila, the idea was that a very expensive passport, $185, aimed to the Congolese elite, the elite that's still traveling on a monthly basis, essentially, that needs passport over and over the years, will pay for the expensive ID project for normal, let's say, Congolese citizens. That was being pitched in early 2014. And that's what tried to develop around like the next month, where two contracts essentially made their way through the administrative system of Congolese state in parallel. One was for the ID card, one was for the passport. But in the end, it's only the passport contracts that went further. That was actually the passports were created and were delivered to the Congolese citizen. And not to mention that deal, the passport deal, is currently investigated by the prosecutor in Belgium over a corruption allegation.
So then what went wrong?
What went wrong is essentially, according to two sources that were very familiar with this deal, is like the money intended to be used to finance the ID card through different financial mechanisms was, let's say, not being routed to that purposes and being rerouted to people close to the Kabila family within different ways, let's say. And one of that way that we uncovered for the first time in that story is the money was used to leverage a loan to finance the construction of a big shopping center called Hypnose in Lubumbashi. Lubumbashi is the second city of DRC. It's in the east part of DRC, in the mining region of Katanga. It's the main city of Katanga. And this building, which is a brand new, super technological, expensive building, according to our source, was built thanks to the money that was originally intended to be used for the ID card project.
All right, stick with us, Tomas. When we come back, we'll look at how 10 years on, Congo still hasn't managed to set up an ID system. We'll be right back. So welcome back. Tomas Statius is still with us, and we're talking about his deep dive investigation into Congo's failed attempts to develop a national ID system. Tomas, thanks so much for sticking with us through this pod. So there still isn't an ID system, which you go into great detail about in your reporting. Is the government even trying to get there? Where are the plans at this point?
It's interesting because it's the goal, the fact that the president announced very early on after being elected that he will put up an ID system is like a constant in the 10 past years of history of Congo. So when Félix Tshisekedi, the current president of DRC, was elected after a very contested election in 2019, he promised very early on that he will have an ID system like set up and so on. And that's what happens over the past 4 years, an attempt to again create this ID card system with the difficulty that we talked about previously in this podcast. The government signed one of the most expensive biometric deals in the history of Africa with a French vendor and Malian partner for $1.2 billion. And the contract, again, is suspected to be overpriced. The finance watchdog of Congo found a lot of irregularities in the whole financing structure, let's say, of the program. So once again, the promises to have this ID card that was made to the Congolese citizen very early on by President Tshisekedi is not fulfilled and will likely not be fulfilled in the next months. And what we can fear is because there were some ID cards that were produced and given to a couple of Congolese VIPs, that this ID card will become like an object of collection for very wealthy Congolese people. Because at the time, as far as our sources go, we know there's roughly 1,000 ID cards that were produced over this $1.2 billion contract.
Wow. Tomas, when you went there, I mean, what is the reaction on the ground? Especially you outlined that some of the funds you found in the report were siphoned to this new mall. What do citizens say?
I would say any situation is not black and white, right? There is a sense that this pattern of like misuse of money is like an ongoing situation and a never-ending situation in Congo. But I would say that people are very tired also of like this corruption scheme, but also tired of something else, tired of the whole framing of, let's say, corruption as an African problem. Corruption, in a sense, is also a problem of some of those companies that are coming and are participating in those essentially scheme. This is a two-way stuff. It's not only and solely an African government problem. There is another investigation, at least in France, for instance, ongoing on another vendor, part of a very big group for corruption allegation in Africa. So hopefully, like, those investigation will set the record straight, proving that it's not only an African problem, but also like a due diligence and a good practices that those companies need to have when they're working in large government tendering process.
And as you mentioned, Congolese people are still waiting as this process carries on. Tomas, thank you so much for joining us. It's a really fascinating report, really well done by you and the team. And we want to make sure everybody knows that you can read his investigation on Bloomberg right now. And we are going to put a link in the show notes. Thank you so much, Tomas.
Thank you, Jeneifer.
And as Tomas noted, ID systems in much of the world are considered a basic right as citizens. Without it, as the World Bank says, people can be left feeling like foreigners in their own country. As we approach the UN's 2030 Sustainable Development Goal target, we'll watch to see what progress is actually being made in granting people the ability to obtain a legal identity and how that then affects their countries and their public officials. This program was produced by Adrian Bradley. Don't forget to follow and review this podcast wherever you usually get your podcasts. I'm Jeneifer Zabasajja. Thanks as always for listening.